Welcome back to the channel. Here we talk about networking and cybersecurity. So today we're going to be talking about FortiSIEM architecture. And I picked a rather complex situation so that maybe you can look back on a FortiSIEM deployment that was already made and understand why some of these decisions were made. Maybe there's some things you can take into consideration when you're looking at FortiSIEM architecture. So before we jump in, any opinions in this video, any advice in this video is my own and is not reflecting the opinions of any past, present, or future employers. That being said, I recommend that you reach out to an expert if you are looking to deploy FortiSIEM in order to help you with this process, right? So there's lots of resources at Fortinet, as well as with other integrators that may be able to assist you. So in this example that I've got on the whiteboard behind me here, we've got 5 satellite locations, an HQ, and we've got a DR as well. One of those satellite locations is going to be small, and I'm going to show you the different approach we're going to take in order to achieve the goals for this particular example. Based on your organization, these goals and needs may be a little different. Again, so I would recommend that you consult someone who is knowledgeable in this area. With that, I'm going to jump over to the whiteboard here. Got my handy dandy marker. We'll start with the HQ site. So as we're looking at FortiSIEM, the first thing we're going to have to deploy is a super or supervisor. So we're going to start there. That's going to give us our administrative GUI. That's going to, in smaller deployments, it could be a standalone appliance that is a supervisor. In this case, we're just leveraging it as really an admin GUI. We're going to do some reporting and other functions on it. We'll also distribute that load to workers. So our workers not only can receive partial logs from our collectors, but they can also distribute the load of that reporting. And the way that we do that is we actually set the database on a NFS file share. So that way the workers can have direct access to add to the database, to pull for reporting functions right directly from that file share. So with that, we've got the workers, we've got the supervisor. The other component of FortiSIEM that we want to talk about is the collectors. We're going to have one local here at the HQ site. I'll make it a little circle so we can easily differentiate. So the collector then is going to collect things like SNMP and syslog data. And that's going to allow us to have both NOC and SOC capabilities within FortiSIEM. So the main function of the collector, we're going to parse that data, right? And we're going to also do discovery, right? So we can do dynamic discovery automatically, discover new devices, new network infrastructure devices, for example, and then report that back to FortiSIEM. Now those collectors, typically you're going to connect directly to a worker. Now they could connect to the supervisor, but typically we would want that load off of the supervisor so it can focus on the administrative GUI, reporting, and other functions that it needs to do, like taking care of the CMDB. So now that I mentioned the CMDB, I will tell you that we have the database on the NFS share here, but the CMDB, which is going to carry our SNMP information, administrative users, etc., is actually going to remain on the super itself. We also have the SVN database, which is going to have the running config and startup config of the devices in our CMDB. So when we have those network devices, we're going to pull the configurations, we're going to store them in the SVN database. So there are multiple databases, and those two in particular, CMDB and SVN, are going to still live on the super. They're not going to be on that file share. That is an important note. So as we go to these sites, and I'll start kind of on the bigger sites over here, I'll imagine we're going to use the same architecture for 2 through 5. I've got them drawn out here, but I'll just draw in the little 5 section here. So really we're going to put a collector at each of these sites. And then, of course, that is going to do our discovery, and I'll abbreviate there, and our parsing. Now, an important thing to note here is that we have not defined what kind of WAN this is. So in this case, it could be MPLS, it could be DIA, Direct Internet Access circuits. It doesn't really matter. We're not going to be concerned too much about this because between our collector and our workers, or you could do the super directly, we're actually going to encrypt that traffic, and I'm drawing a kind of a tunnel. It's not really a tunnel. It's really just over HTTPS, right? And that S is important because we're securing that traffic, we're encrypting that traffic. So that way, if there's anyone snooping, whether it's an MPLS link through our ISP, maybe it's a DIA circuit where we're going through multiple ISPs potentially. If there's anyone sniffing that traffic, it's encrypted, we're okay. The other thing to note is we also compress those logs, right? So we're not only going to encrypt them, we're also going to compress them so that if we have a slow WAN link, we're not taking as much bandwidth as we would if we didn't compress those logs, right? So we're able to reduce the load there a little bit if there are some slow links within the network. So for the sake of demonstration, I'm not going to scribble all over the board, but you can imagine the same thing going on at sites 2 through 5. Relatively large sites, they could be VM deployments, they could be hardware collectors depending on our use case. The VM collectors are not licensed, as well as the workers, right? So you can deploy as many VMs as you want without paying for additional licensing. You're really licensing the events per second and the device count that we have on FortiSIEM. So you're not going to necessarily, have to license each individual VM. So if you want to spin up more workers, you want to spin up more collectors, you want to add more virtual CPUs or RAM, there's no licensing associated with that. It's just all included there. Now, I want to give an interesting example here with this smaller site. So maybe this smaller site only has a few users, isn't really worth purchasing a hardware collector, but at the same time, you don't have a virtualization cluster, so maybe we don't have anything locally here at this small site. How are we going to address this from an SNMP monitoring standpoint and a syslog standpoint? Because this, as we've mentioned before, we don't really have this defined. This could be just internet access. We don't want to send unencrypted SNMP and syslog over the internet, so that's a concern. Well, we have to have a collector somewhere in order to get this data. So what I'll do in this example is I'll go ahead and stand up another collector dedicated to small sites. Maybe there's multiple, or maybe we're planning on growing. And we're also going to leverage these firewalls in order to make a VPN tunnel. And of course, we'll utilize the tried and true IPsec. So with IPsec on the FortiGate, it is offloaded, so you'll get plenty of throughput if we're using the FortiGate firewall platform. Other vendors' results may vary, but Fortinet offloads that to ASIC, and so we really don't see problems with IPsec throughput when we're talking FortiGate. So with that, we're going to leverage the IPsec tunnel to provide us the encryption that we need for that SNMP and syslog data that is going up to this collector. Now, we've talked about all this, and this is all good. We've got collectors. They'll send the data to the workers insert it into the database. We are doing correlation before we insert that into the database. So the workers will look for partial matches while that information is in RAM. So before we actually put it on disk, it's in RAM. We look for any potential correlation. If there is any potential correlation or partial matches, we're going to send that over to the supervisor, and it will then decide if there is a full match. This way we can do correlation a lot faster than a lot of other SIEMs would. In the past, I've used some SIEM products that were very, very slow in order to get logs, to get them to be usable, and to get them to where we could perform alerts, automations based on that. It took a long time. So that is definitely a plus for FortiSIEM there. So the next thing I want to talk about is disaster recovery. So in a situation where HQ for some reason is unavailable, here in Houston we have lots of hurricanes, right? So it's not super uncommon to see a hurricane, a natural disaster happen, and to have a disaster recovery plan if those kinds of events happen. So what we'll need to do in order to have a proper DR is the first thing we have to do is stand up identical infrastructure from a super and worker standpoint. So we're going to spin up a passive super. We're going to spin up 2 workers in order to match these 2 workers over here. But it's important to note we should have the same resources on both sides so that in the event of a failover, right, we don't have any bottlenecking, we don't have any issues. So we should have identical setups here in the DR. Again, we'll have that NFS database. Now these databases are going to sync with rsync. And then, of course, they will have access to this database. We're also going to need to sync these databases, the CMDB and the SVN database. So those will sync super to super. So we'll have two different syncs going on here. We'll have the rsync between the two NFS databases, and then we will have the CMDB and SVN sync between the two supers. Now what happens in the event that HQ is unavailable? There is one missing piece here. Well, if HQ is unavailable, we probably won't need the local collector here. But what about this collector? What about this small site? So what we can do, when we set up all of our syslog forwarding, we can set that up with a DNS entry, and we'll fail over that DNS entry to a collector over here. Now it's important to note that's not the only thing we're going to leverage DNS for. All these other collectors also have a DNS entry, an FQDN, listed as their workers. So the workers, we're going to have to fail over that DNS as well. This is a manual process. We can script it, we can automate it with some other tools, but keep that in mind. The other thing that we want to do is, in order to fail over, this super has to manually, via CLI, you have to log in and you have to initiate it to be the active super. So it is, again, a semi-manual process. In this situation, that's how we avoid a split brain scenario, right? So we need to keep that consistent on our network in order to make sure that we're not logging here and logging there, and then we have two separate databases with different parts of the logging. So we want to make sure that we don't have that kind of scenario. And then, of course, if we were to get the site back up, then we'd have to take the database from here, replicate it backwards, and then reinitiate this as the primary and that as the secondary. So hopefully this has gone to help you kind of understand the architecture behind FortiSIEM and help you make some educated decisions in order to deploy it. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, drop them in the comments. Be happy to answer them. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.